The night was calm, the streets were silent, and only the sound of crickets filled the air. Then suddenly, a loud crack broke the peace. Flames shot up from the small family's house, lighting the dark sky with an orange glow. The fire grew fast, swallowing the wooden walls, climbing to the roof, and turning the home into a giant torch. Neighbors rushed out of their doors, some holding phones, some carrying buckets of water, but none of it could fight the raging flames. Whispers moved from mouth to mouth, fear mixing with curiosity. Some said it was an accident, some said it was bad wiring, but others, more careful with their words, hinted that this was not natural. The family stood barefoot on the cold ground, eyes wide with shock. The mother clutched her children close, their faces pressed into her dress as they cried. The father stood still, his fists tight, his heart breaking as every memory turned to ash before his eyes. The house he had built with years of work was now falling in pieces of black smoke. Nobody noticed the figure standing across the street, hidden by shadows. The HOA president, dressed neatly even at this late hour, watched with a strange smile on his face. His eyes reflected the fire as if it was a show made only for him. He didn't lift a finger to help, didn't shout for aid, didn't show worry. Instead, he folded his arms and let the flames do the talking. The fire department's sirens screamed in the distance, but the fire was already too strong. Neighbors shouted instructions, some ran to move cars, others tried to comfort the crying children. Smoke spread across the block, making everyone cough. The mother begged for someone to save the photo albums, the toys, the furniture, but it was too late. Everything inside was trapped under fire. The father wanted to rush in, but strong arms of neighbors pulled him back, telling him he would die if he entered. He dropped to his knees, his tears mixing with the dirt. His heart pounded as he watched his life collapse in front of him. When the fire trucks finally arrived, hoses sprayed water with force, but the flames had already done their job. The roof crashed down with a heavy roar, sparks flying into the air. The family screamed at the sound, children hiding their faces. The neighbors gasped, some covering their mouths, some whispering prayers. The father stared at the ground, but his eyes slowly lifted toward the crowd. In the corner, beyond the flashing red lights, he caught sight of a man who wasn't moving like the others. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't crying, he wasn't even pretending to be worried. He just stood still, the orange firelight showing his sharp smile. The father's chest tightened. He knew that face. It was the president of the HOA. A man who had argued with him many times about the house, about rules, about payments. A man who had said more than once, "This neighborhood doesn't need people like you." The father blinked, and the man was gone. Maybe it was the smoke, maybe it was his imagination, but his gut told him the truth. This was no accident. Someone had wanted his home gone, and that someone had stood there watching like a king enjoying the fall of a servant. Hours later, when the fire was finally under control, nothing remained but black ash and broken wood. The family was given blankets, the children taken inside a neighbor's house to rest. But the father couldn't rest. He walked slowly toward the ruins, ignoring the warnings of the firefighters. His feet crunched on the burned ground. He bent down, picking up a piece of charred wood, then dropped it. His hands trembled, not just from sadness but from anger. His eyes searched the ground until they caught a corner of something that had not burned completely. He bent again and pulled it out. It was a paper, half-burned, but still readable. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the stamp on the corner, the HOA's official mark. His mind screamed with questions. Why would their stamp be inside his home? What document was this? He hid the paper quickly inside his jacket before anyone saw. He turned his eyes to the street again, but the HOA president was nowhere to be found. Only the silence of the destroyed house and the whispers of neighbors remained. The father's jaw tightened. He knew now that this was not over. The fire had destroyed his home, but it had also lit a fire inside him. A fire that would not rest until the truth was out. That night, as his family slept in borrowed beds, the father sat awake, staring at the burned paper again and again. His mind replayed every meeting, every word, every threat the HOA had spoken to him. The fire was not just flames. It was a message. They wanted to break him, to push him out, to show their power. But they had made a mistake. He was not broken. He was only stronger now. The ashes of his home whispered one promise in the dark. This fight was just beginning. The next morning the sun rose over black smoke still rising from the ashes. The street smelled of burned wood and melted plastic, and the family stood outside, holding each other close. Their eyes were swollen from crying, their clothes still smelling of smoke. The neighbors came with soft words, bringing food, clothes, and blankets, but their kindness could not fill the empty hole left inside the father's chest. He stared at the ruins, every broken piece reminding him of years of work now turned to dust. His wife tried to stay strong for the children, but when she thought nobody was looking, she wiped silent tears with the corner of her sleeve. The children asked simple questions with innocent voices. Where are my toys? When will we go home? But nobody had the strength to answer. The father's hands shook, not from weakness but from anger. He remembered the shadow in the night, the man who had watched the fire as if it was a show. He remembered the strange smile that carried no pity. The image burned in his mind harder than the flames had burned his house. As firefighters searched through the rubble, one of them told the family the truth in a low voice. The fire spread too fast to be natural. There were signs of fuel. The father listened, his blood turning cold. His eyes darkened as he whispered inside his heart, it was them. Later that day, the HOA held a community meeting. The family, still in borrowed clothes, walked in quietly. The room was full of chatter until the father entered. Conversations stopped for a moment, eyes turned, but quickly looked away. The HOA president stood at the front, wearing his suit, his tie neat, his face calm as if nothing had happened. He spoke about rules, about safety, about how everyone should check their houses for fire hazards. His voice was smooth, but the father heard only lies. The mother sat with the children, trying to keep them calm, but her eyes were on the board members. She could see fear hidden behind their practiced smiles. The father stood tall, not saying a word, but his silence was heavier than stone. Whispers spread in the room, neighbors remembering things they had seen and heard, wondering if they should speak. The father's heart beat strong. He knew the truth was close, but he also knew the enemy was powerful. He had no home, no wealth, no allies. All he had was his anger, his family, and the half-burned paper hidden in his jacket pocket. He touched it again and again, feeling its rough edges. That paper was small, but it was hope. It was proof. The meeting ended with fake smiles and empty promises, but as people left, the father stayed behind, staring straight at the HOA president. Their eyes met for one heavy moment. No words were spoken, but the fire between them was clear. One had burned down a house, and the other would burn down their lies. That night, while his family slept in the corner of a motel room, the father sat awake, writing down every detail, every memory, every word the HOA had spoken over the years. He was building his own case in silence. His mind was sharp, his resolve unshaken. The flames had destroyed his home, but now, inside him, a different fire had started, one that would not stop until justice was served. The days passed slowly, but the pain did not fade. The family lived in the small motel, cramped into one room with thin walls and broken furniture. The children asked when they could go home, and the mother hugged them tightly, hiding her tears behind a smile. The father went out every morning, walking back to the burned land where their house once stood. Neighbors sometimes joined him, speaking in whispers about strange things they had seen before the fire. One neighbor mentioned late-night visits by certain HOA members. Another spoke of threats about keeping the neighborhood clean. Every word added fuel to the fire burning inside the father. One evening, he found more than whispers. While kicking through the blackened rubble, his foot struck a half-melted lockbox. With effort, he pulled it out, coughing from the dust. Inside, despite the smoke, some papers had survived. His hands trembled as he opened them. He saw documents with HOA signatures, letters about fines, warnings that seemed less like rules and more like threats. His chest tightened as he realized these were not just papers. They were proof of a plan to push his family out. His heart raced with both fear and strength. That night, at the motel, he showed the papers to his wife. She looked at him with wide eyes, her voice shaking. "If they know you have this, they will come for you." He nodded, his jaw set. He knew the risk, but he also knew they could not stay silent. The next day, there was another HOA meeting. The father walked into the hall, this time with a different look. His eyes were sharp, his steps steady. Conversations stopped again as people noticed him. The HOA president kept his calm mask, but his fingers tapped the desk nervously. The father sat down in silence, clutching the folder under his arm. He did not speak, but his presence was enough to create tension. Neighbors leaned toward each other, whispering again. The mother sat beside him, holding the children close, her face pale but brave. The HOA began their meeting, pretending all was normal, talking about lawns, fences, and community rules. But everyone in the room could feel the weight in the air. When the father finally stood, the room fell silent. He did not raise his voice, he did not point fingers, but he said words that made hearts pound. A home burned down in this neighborhood. A family lost everything. And yet, some people smile in the shadows. His words hung heavy in the hall. The HOA president shifted in his seat, trying to laugh it off, but the neighbors were watching. Eyes turned from the father to the board members, searching for cracks in their calm faces. The father sat down again, but his silence after speaking was louder than any shout. That night, as the family walked back to the motel, the father's mind was set. He had proof, he had suspicion, and now he had the attention of the community. The battle was no longer hidden in smoke. The war between truth and power had just begun. That night the father could not sleep. The motel room was silent except for the soft breathing of his wife and children, but his mind was loud with thoughts. He sat by the small window, staring at the parking lot lights, holding the burned papers in his hands. His eyes traced every line, every stamp, every signature. The words were clear, threats hidden as warnings, rules twisted into weapons, and fines so cruel they could destroy a family. He realized the fire was not just a punishment. It was a message to anyone who dared to resist the HOA's power. His anger grew heavier with every word he read, but under that anger was also fear. If they had burned his house, what else were they capable of? Would they hurt his children next? Would they silence him before he could speak? He closed his eyes, whispered a promise to himself, and decided he would not be silent anymore. The next morning he returned to the ruins of his home. Ash still covered the ground, black pieces of wood stuck out like broken bones, and the air smelled faintly of smoke. As he walked through the rubble, his foot caught on something solid buried under the ash. He knelt and dug with his hands until he pulled out a piece of metal. It was a melted canister, its edges sharp, its surface smelling of gasoline. His heart pounded. This was no accident. This was proof that someone had started the fire on purpose. He wrapped it carefully in a cloth and placed it in his bag. Later that day, he met with a neighbor who had always been friendly but cautious. The neighbor lowered his voice and confessed something he had kept secret. He had seen men near the house the night before the fire, carrying cans and whispering. He had been too afraid to speak, afraid of the HOA's power, but now he regretted his silence. The father gripped his arm, his eyes filled with both gratitude and fire. This was the second piece of proof, and it was even stronger than the first. When evening came, the family walked back into the HOA meeting hall. The atmosphere was different now. People were restless, murmuring in small groups, eyes darting from the father to the board members. The president sat in his chair, pretending calm, but his jaw was tight, his eyes colder than usual. The father sat quietly, his wife by his side, the children close. He did not speak right away. He waited, letting the tension grow. When the president started talking about community safety, the father stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound cut through the room like a blade. He pulled the cloth from his bag and placed the burned canister on the table in front of everyone. The room gasped. The president's face froze for a second, then he forced a smile. "That proves nothing," he said quickly, but his voice cracked at the edges. The neighbors leaned forward, whispering louder now. They could see the fear behind his mask. The father spoke in a calm but steady voice. "My house did not burn by accident. And I will not stop until the truth is heard." He didn't shout, but his words carried like thunder. The neighbors looked at one another, some nodding, some shaking their heads nervously, but everyone knew the silence in the neighborhood had been broken. That night, as the family left the hall, they could feel eyes watching from the shadows. The father kept his head high, but he knew the danger was greater than ever. The HOA was powerful, and now he had challenged them openly. The fight would not stay hidden anymore. The fire had started with his home, but it would spread through the whole community until justice was either won or destroyed. The days after the meeting were heavy with tension. The father noticed how neighbors looked at him differently now. Some showed silent support with small nods when he passed, while others avoided his eyes out of fear, not wanting to be seen taking sides. The motel room grew colder with each night, not because of the weather, but because of the weight of uncertainty pressing down on the family. His wife tried to keep the children smiling, telling them stories and keeping their minds away from the loss, but she herself could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames swallowing their home. The father spent hours awake, pacing the floor, his mind full of questions. He could feel the HOA closing in, their power stretching through every corner of the neighborhood like invisible hands ready to crush him. One evening, as he walked alone back from the ruined house, he saw a car parked at the end of the street. The headlights turned off, but the shape of two figures sitting inside was clear. When he stopped, the car engine roared and the vehicle sped away into the night. His heart pounded. He knew it was not random. They were watching him. He returned to the motel more determined than ever. He placed the papers, the burned canister, and all the notes he had written into a single folder. His wife looked at him with worry, her voice trembling. "They will come after you." He met her eyes and said in a steady tone, "Let them come. I am ready." The next HOA meeting was more crowded than ever. Neighbors filled the hall, whispering before it began. Rumors had spread fast about the burned canister and the papers the father had shown. People were no longer comfortable staying silent. When the board members entered, their smiles looked thinner, their steps less confident. The president sat at the front, adjusting his tie, his jaw tight. He began with the usual calm voice, talking about lawns, parking, and safety, but the words sounded hollow in the heavy silence. Everyone in the room waited for the father to speak. He stood slowly, unfolding his folder, his eyes locked on the president. This time, he spoke not with anger, but with cold clarity. He read lines from the HOA warnings, letters that demanded money, threats disguised as rules, words that showed clear harassment. Gasps filled the room as neighbors realized how the HOA had abused power. Some stood up, pointing fingers at the board, recalling similar threats made to them. The president tried to interrupt, but his voice was drowned by the growing noise of people finding courage. For the first time, the HOA was losing control of the room. The father then lifted the burned canister for all to see. The weight of the object and the smell of gasoline still clinging to it silenced the hall instantly. His voice dropped low, but carried to every ear. "This is not proof of bad wiring. This is proof of evil." His words cut sharp, and the room broke into loud murmurs. The president slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "Enough! You have no evidence that we are behind this." But the crack in his voice betrayed his fear. The father stepped closer to him, their eyes locking once again, a silent war raging between them in front of everyone. That night, after the meeting ended in chaos, the father returned to the motel with his family. He knew he had shaken the ground under the HOA's feet, but he also knew they would not back down easily. Power does not fall without a fight. He sat at the small motel table, staring at the folder of evidence. His wife placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "This is bigger than us now." He nodded slowly, realizing she was right. This was not just about their burned home. It was about justice for the entire community. The battle had begun, and the courtroom would soon become the fire where the truth would finally burn. The motel room felt smaller with each passing night. The children slept close together, their soft breathing filling the silence, but the parents stayed awake, their minds restless. The mother kept glancing at the door as if she expected it to burst open at any moment. The father sat at the edge of the bed, the folder of evidence on his lap, his eyes fixed on the burned papers as though they were the only light left in his life. He knew the HOA would strike back soon. They had money, they had lawyers, and they had fear on their side. But he had something stronger: truth. He whispered to himself, steadying his spirit, "They can burn my house, but they cannot burn justice." The next morning, he visited a lawyer recommended by a neighbor. The office was small but filled with heavy books that smelled of dust and power. The lawyer listened carefully as the father laid out the papers, the threats, and finally the burned canister. At first the lawyer's face was neutral, but as the story unfolded, his eyes sharpened. When he held up the canister and smelled the faint gasoline, his jaw tightened. "This is arson," he said in a voice that carried both shock and resolve. "And if the HOA is behind this, then they will face the law." For the first time since the fire, the father felt a spark of hope. He shook the lawyer's hand firmly, and in that moment, he knew he had found an ally. Word spread quickly that the family had gone to the law. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to whisper louder. Some came forward with their own stories: fines that had no reason, warnings that felt like threats, strange letters slipped under doors in the night. The father collected every word, writing it all down, adding it to his growing case. The more he gathered, the clearer the picture became. This was not about one house. This was about power, greed, and control. The HOA had been ruling through fear, and now the mask was slipping. One night, as the father walked back from the lawyer's office, he noticed footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but the street was empty. He walked faster, his heart pounding, only to hear the footsteps again. When he spun around, a dark car at the corner flicked on its headlights and slowly rolled away. His fists tightened. They were watching him, trying to scare him. But instead of breaking, it only made him stronger. He walked into the motel room, kissed his children on their foreheads, and whispered to his wife, "They're scared. That means we're winning." The next HOA meeting came sooner than expected. The board members looked sharper this time, their voices louder, their speeches rehearsed. They spoke about community harmony, about lies being spread, about how rumors could destroy neighborhoods. But the crowd was restless. People shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward the father. He stood slowly, every step echoing against the wooden floor, and placed the folder on the table. The sound of papers hitting would cut through the speeches. He opened it and began to read out loud, his voice calm but powerful. Every letter, every unfair fine, every unexplained warning filled the air. The neighbors gasped, some murmured in anger, some in fear, but none could deny what they were hearing. The HOA president clenched his fists, his smile cracking as sweat appeared on his forehead. Then the father placed the burned canister on the table once more. The room fell into silence. He spoke with fire in his voice. "My home is gone. My children sleep on motel beds. But this," he tapped the canister, "this proves my house did not burn by chance. It was done by design." His words echoed like thunder. The president slammed the table, shouting, "Lies! You have no proof it was us." But his voice shook, and his denial only made the neighbors whisper louder. The father leaned forward, his eyes locked on the president's. "If it was not you, then why do your documents lie in the ashes of my home?" The hall erupted with noise. Neighbors shouted questions, others demanded answers. The board members looked trapped, their calm masks breaking under the weight of suspicion. The father gathered his papers and the canister, holding them close. "The truth will not be buried under ash. The court will decide." With those words, he walked out, his family following close behind. That night, as he lay awake once more, he felt the storm gathering. The HOA was cornered, but cornered enemies were dangerous. He knew the next steps would be harder, but he also knew there was no turning back. His family's future, and the truth itself, depended on the fire he now carried inside his heart. The day of the first court hearing arrived, and the family woke early in their cramped motel room. The children rubbed sleep from their eyes, not fully understanding what was about to happen, but sensing the tension in the air. The mother dressed them neatly, smoothing their clothes with shaking hands, while the father stood silently by the window, staring out at the rising sun. He wore an old suit, pressed as best as possible, his eyes dark but steady. In his hands, he clutched the folder filled with papers, warnings, and the burned canister wrapped carefully in cloth. This was more than just a court case. It was the only chance to prove the truth. As they walked into the courthouse, whispers followed them. People from the neighborhood had come to watch, some curious, some supportive, some afraid. The HOA members arrived in polished cars, wearing expensive suits, their faces set in masks of confidence, but their eyes restless. The president led them, walking tall, but the father saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when their eyes met. Inside the courtroom, the judge sat high above, expression stern and unreadable. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters clicked pens, and the air was heavy with anticipation. The father sat at the front with his lawyer by his side, his wife holding his hand tightly. Across the room, the HOA board members whispered among themselves, pretending calm. The judge called for silence, and the case began. The HOA's lawyer stood first, speaking with a smooth voice, painting the father as reckless, irresponsible, and careless with safety rules. He claimed the fire was an accident caused by the family's own negligence. Murmurs rippled through the room, and for a moment, doubt tried to creep into the minds of the listeners. But then the father's lawyer rose. He laid the burned letters on the judge's desk, each stamped with the HOA's seal. He showed the fine notices, the threats, the warnings that sounded more like orders of exile. The courtroom shifted. People leaned forward, their interest sharpening. Finally, the father himself stood. His voice was low at first, but strong. He described the night of the fire, the smell of smoke, the roar of the flames, the sight of the president standing in the shadows with a smile. Gasps echoed, some eyes turning to the HOA president, whose face flushed red though he forced a thin smile. Then the father placed the burned canister on the table in front of everyone. The faint scent of gasoline still clung to it. The silence was absolute as he said, "Homes do not burn like this by accident. This was set. This was meant to destroy not only wood and stone, but a family." The judge's pen scratched against paper, his face unreadable, but the weight of the evidence was clear. The HOA's lawyer tried to object, claiming it was circumstantial, but the damage was done. The neighbors watching from the benches whispered louder now, recalling their own experiences, remembering threats and strange warnings. The cracks in the HOA's armor were widening. The president clenched his fists under the table, his mask slipping, sweat forming on his forehead. When the session ended for the day, the family walked out through the courthouse doors. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, voices asking questions. The father did not speak to them, but his silence carried power. The image of him walking with his wife and children at his side spread quickly, a symbol of resistance against the abuse of power. The HOA members left through the side door, avoiding the crowd, their heads lowered despite their expensive suits. That night, back in the motel, the family gathered together, their hearts still racing. The mother whispered prayers of thanks, the children clung to her arms, and the father sat at the small table, staring at the folder. He knew the fight was not over. This was only the beginning of a long battle. The HOA still had money, still had influence, and they would not go down quietly. But he also knew something else. Power built on fear is fragile. The fire had burned his home, but it had also burned away the silence of the neighborhood. Now people were watching, people were speaking, and people were questioning. The father looked at his children, then at his wife, and whispered, "They tried to break us, but tomorrow we rise stronger." The second day in court began with even more people filling the benches. Word had spread through the community, and now curious faces, worried neighbors, and even strangers came to see the battle unfold. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every cough, every shuffle of paper echoing louder than normal. The family sat quietly, the children tucked between their parents, their small eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Across the room, the HOA members sat together, whispering in hushed tones, their expensive suits unable to hide the nervous flicker in their eyes. The president tried to look calm, but his fingers tapped the table again and again, betraying his unease. The judge called the session to order, and witnesses were summoned. One by one, neighbors took the stand. At first, their voices were cautious, hesitant, but as the questioning continued, their courage grew. A woman admitted she had seen two men near the family's house the night before the fire, carrying containers that looked like gas cans. Another neighbor spoke of strange threats whispered by HOA members during late-night meetings. A man revealed he had received fines for small things, like planting flowers in the wrong color, fines so large that he had almost lost his home. Each testimony added weight, layer upon layer, building a wall of truth against the lies of the HOA. The father listened with a steady gaze, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his heart pounding with both anger and hope. The HOA's lawyer tried desperately to twist the words, questioning each witness harshly, suggesting they were mistaken or biased. But the cracks in the story were too many, and the faces of the board members betrayed fear with every passing moment. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The father was called to the stand once again. He rose slowly, the room silent as he walked to the witness chair. His voice was calm, but there was steel in every word. He described how his children cried as their home burned, how his wife begged to save even a single memory, how his own hands were burned when he tried to break through the flames. He told them of the papers he found in the ash, the threats written in official HOA language, the smile on the president's face as fire consumed everything. His words painted a picture so clear that many in the courtroom had tears in their eyes. Finally, the lawyer asked him the hardest question, "Why do you believe the HOA did this?" The father reached into his bag, pulled out the burned canister, and set it on the table once again. The silence was complete, as if the whole room was holding its breath. He looked directly at the president and answered, "Because my home was not destroyed by chance. It was destroyed by those who wanted to silence me. But they failed." His voice shook with emotion, but it carried across the room like thunder. The president's face turned pale, his lips pressed tightly together, his mask nearly broken. When the session ended, the judge announced that the court would reconvene the next week for closing arguments. The room erupted with noise as people stood, some shouting at the HOA members, others rushing to the family to offer support. The president and his board left quickly, their heads down, their once unshakable confidence now shattered. The father walked out slowly with his wife and children, his step steady, his eyes forward. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them, holding his family close. For the first time since the fire, he felt a glimmer of victory. That night in the motel, the family sat together in silence. The children finally slept peacefully, exhausted from the long day. The mother leaned against her husband, whispering, "We are closer now." He nodded, staring at the folder still resting on the table. He knew the war was not yet won, but he also knew the tide had turned. The fire had destroyed their house, but it had lit a flame in the community. People were no longer afraid to speak, no longer willing to be silent. As he closed his eyes, the father whispered to himself, "Next week, the truth will finish what the fire began." The day of the closing arguments arrived, and the courthouse was filled beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, reporters lined the walls, and the heavy air buzzed with whispers. Everyone wanted to see how the battle between one broken family and a powerful HOA would end. The father walked in with his wife and children close by, his face calm but his steps firm. His suit was old, but his eyes carried the fire of truth. The HOA members entered next, their polished shoes clicking on the floor, their heads held high, but their smiles looked strained, their confidence cracked from days of testimony. The president adjusted his tie again and again, each movement betraying his nervousness. The judge called for silence, and the HOA's lawyer stood first. He spoke with smooth words, trying to drown the truth under polished lies. He said the family was careless, that the fire was an accident, that the neighbors' testimonies were built on fear and imagination. He waved his hands dramatically, claiming the burned canister meant nothing, claiming the papers were ordinary warnings misinterpreted. His voice grew louder, but the more he spoke, the more desperate he sounded. The father watched him without blinking, knowing that words built on lies were weaker than fire built on smoke. Then the father's lawyer stood. His voice was steady, every word sharp like a blade. He held up the fines, the threats, the warnings stamped with the HOA seal. He repeated the neighbors' testimonies, their stories of intimidation and abuse. Finally, he lifted the burned canister for all to see, the smell of gasoline still clinging faintly. The room grew silent, so silent that even the scratching of the judge's pen stopped. The lawyer's voice rang clear, "This is not an accident. This is not carelessness. This is arson. And the people responsible sit right here before you." He pointed to the HOA board, and all eyes turned to them. The president's face flushed red, his jaw clenched, his mask slipping further. But the greatest moment came when the father himself stood to give his final words. He looked at the judge, then at the crowded room, then finally at the HOA members who had once controlled everything. His voice carried pain, but also strength. "My home was not just wood and stone. It was memories. It was my children's laughter, my wife's love, the walls that held our dreams. They burned it to ash, thinking they could silence us, thinking fear would win. But fire cannot destroy truth. Fire cannot kill justice. And today, I stand not just for my family, but for every neighbor who has been silenced by their power. Today, the flames they lit will burn their lies instead." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some gasps, some even clapping before the judge called for order. The HOA members looked shaken, their power slipping like sand through fingers. The judge announced that he would deliver the final verdict the following day. The tension in the room was unbearable as people filed out, whispering and speculating. Reporters rushed forward, capturing every word, every glance, every step. The family walked out slowly, their heads held high, their unity stronger than ever. That night, back at the motel, the father sat by the dim lamp, staring at his children as they slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. His wife placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "No matter what happens tomorrow, we did not let them win." He nodded, his heart steady, his resolve unbreakable. He knew the verdict could go either way. Powerful enemies still held strings behind closed doors, but he also knew the truth had been spoken. The silence that once ruled the community had been broken forever. As he closed his eyes, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, the fire will finally meet justice." The courthouse was silent the next morning as the judge entered and took his seat. The air was heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of what was about to come. The benches were filled to the last seat, neighbors pressed close together, reporters ready with pens and cameras, and the family sitting in the front row. The father held his wife's hand tightly, his other hand resting on the folder that had carried their truth this far. His heart beat like a drum, but his face stayed calm, his eyes fixed on the judge. Across the room, the HOA board members sat stiffly in their suits. Their polished shoes and expensive ties could not hide the unease written on their faces. The president tried to sit tall, but his eyes darted around nervously, avoiding the father's steady gaze. The judge shuffled papers, then lifted his eyes to the room. His voice was firm, carrying to every corner. He spoke of the evidence presented, the threatening letters, the unfair fines, the testimonies of neighbors, the burned canister smelling of gasoline. He spoke of fear that had ruled the community, of power used as a weapon, and of one family's loss that could no longer be hidden under lies. Each word fell heavy, and with each sentence, the HOA members shifted in their seats, their masks cracking more and more. The judge paused, the room holding its breath, before delivering the words that would change everything. This court finds the HOA board guilty of harassment, abuse of power, and responsibility in the destruction of the family's home. Justice demands accountability. Gasps filled the room, followed by whispers that grew into shouts. Some neighbors cried, some clapped, and some hugged each other in relief. The father closed his eyes, tears slipping down his face, his wife squeezing his hand so tightly it hurt. Their children smiled through tears, not fully understanding, but knowing something good had finally happened. The president slammed his hand on the table, his face red with anger, but guards moved quickly to keep order. His words meant nothing now. The power he had clung to was gone, shattered by the truth he thought he could burn. The judge continued, announcing fines, punishments, and removal of the board from their positions. The family would receive compensation, enough to rebuild, but more importantly, the community was free from the grip of fear. The neighbors turned to the father, nodding, whispering words of gratitude, their eyes filled with respect. For the first time in a long while, the family felt not alone but surrounded by support. When the session ended, the father stood with his family and walked out of the courthouse doors into the sunlight. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, questions flew, but he said nothing. He only lifted his children into his arms and held his wife close, their faces glowing with relief and strength. Behind them, the HOA members were led away, their heads lowered, their once proud power burned to ashes. The crowd outside cheered, voices rising like a wave of freedom breaking against years of silence. That night, back at the motel, the family sat together in peace. For the first time since the fire, they laughed softly, the sound warming the cold room. The father stared at his children and whispered, "Our home was taken, but not our spirit. Tomorrow, we rebuild." His wife leaned her head on his shoulder, smiling through tears. The fire had destroyed their walls, their furniture, their memories, but it had not destroyed their courage. Out of the ashes, they had risen stronger. Justice had been won, and though scars would remain, so too would the truth. The flames that once sought to silence them had instead lit a brighter path. For them, for their children, and for every neighbor who had lived in fear. The story that began with fire ended with light.